Welcome back, life science learners, to the next segment in our lesson today. We've been focusing on energy flow in the last bit. Let's spend some time looking at how energy flows in an ecosystem, and we will do that by looking at food chains, food webs. So let's look at the concepts around energy flow in an ecosystem using food chains and food webs. So what do we look at when we spend some time looking at energy flow? We essentially got to look at how energy moves in an ecosystem. The concept of energy moving is quite difficult to understand. Let's assume we kind of have energy being passed on from one organism to the next. It's important that we recognize that not all the energy that is consumed by one trophic level is available to the next organism. When an organism consumes its food, most of that energy is used by the organism either to grow, to reproduce, to repair. Some of that energy is lost during metabolism. Some of that energy is lost as waste and heat. So the next trophic level that is going to consume the energy available from the previous will always get a significant reduction in the amount of energy. And that's important for us to recognize as we talk about the flow of energy through an ecosystem. And hence, as we move up the complexities of a food chain or the different trophic levels, we will note that there are some individuals or some species that are higher up that need to consume larger volumes of food to be able to get the sustained energy that they need. So remember that as we look at energy flow. So as energy is passed from one trophic level to the next, about 90% of that energy is lost, with some being lost as heat into the environment and some being passed out incompletely as undigested food or digested food. Now this means that there's probably only around 10% of energy is available to the next trophic level as we move from one to the next. So the primary consumers get about 10% of energy produced by the autotrophs. So when we look at our herbivores, they only get 10% of that energy that the herbivores or the autotrophs produced, while your secondary consumers in turn get 1% of the energy initially produced by the autotrophs, and we have the tertiary consumers that get probably 0.1%. So what we see is that there's a significant, as the complexity increases, the amount of energy available significantly decreases. And that's by a ratio of 10% every trophic level. So food chains are the next concept that we're going to look at. The flow of energy in an ecosystem can be examined or explained in the form of a food chain, a food web, or even a pyramid. So the complexity of ecosystems is that we have different levels of organization. One way of representing the level of organization in complexity is being able to show a food chain. Food chains also show the transfer of energy. We also have food webs that show you how food chains are connected and how organisms are interdependent on different levels of organization. So we will look at that. And we need to also recognize that there are arrangements of these food chains in pyramids, and these again illustrate the flow of energy or the number of individuals in an ecosystem. So a food chain is simply an order in which food is passed from one organism to another. Here's a simple illustration. It shows you the energy moving from your producer to your tertiary consumers. And this illustration shows you your producers here being your autotrophs. In this case, it's the carrot plant, and that is a source of energy or feed to the cottontail rabbits, and these consume that. So these will consume that and get the energy. In turn, the primary consumers then become a source of food to the secondary consumers. And so we have these arrows that indicate the flow of energy. Most of these rabbits are consumed by these feral cats, which in turn consume the energy produced by the cottontail rabbits. Some of these feral cats are then in turn consumed by your tertiary consumers like the red fox. And so your red fox then derives its energy from the secondary consumer. So we see that the amount of energy the energy is being transferred from your producer all the way to your secondary consumer. And this again is a linear representation of the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So in a food chain, it's important that we recognize that the first organism in a food chain is always a producer, followed by the primary consumer, then the secondary consumers, and then the tertiary, as indicated in this. The arrows represent the transfer of energy and a matter from one organism which is eaten by another that in turn consumes that. The arrows point the direction of energy flow, and that's important to recognize, is that energy flows in one direction, from your producers all the way to your tertiary consumers. Here's another illustration that shows you our producers, and our producers are the autotrophs that are capable of photosynthesizing. So all autotrophs that photosynthesize become our producers, and they in turn provide energy for our primary consumers, who in turn again are consumed by secondary consumers, who in turn are a source of food for your tertiary consumers. So here we see that the flow of energy again is a unidirectional manner, where we find different levels of organization consuming different amounts of energy. The energy that plants capture from the sun during photosynthesis may end up in the tissues of a hawk, but this is through having to move through different levels of organization. Let's understand this. It gets there via the sparrow, who in turn has consumed the insect, and the insect has in turn consumed the plants. So we see that this relationship shows you how the energy is moved from one trophic level to the next. So I've used the concept of the word trophic level. What does that mean? What does a trophic level mean? The trophic level essentially points to the position an individual or an organism has in the ecosystem. Often our first trophic levels point to the producers. The second trophic levels would be your primary consumers. Your third trophic level would be made up of your secondary consumers. And finally, the fourth trophic level would be your tertiary consumers. So it's important that we note that in a food chain, the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more complex the food chain becomes. And often you would see the first, second, third, and fourth trophic levels in most food chains. Because of energy flowing, there has to be a complex nature of the trophic levels being organized. And that's important for us to recognize as we get into the understanding a food web. Let's look at the food web. As I mentioned, a food web is a diagram that shows how several food chains are linked together in a more complex feeding relationships. Guys, at this point, it's important that we recognize that in any environment or any ecosystem, there are different levels of organization. And what do I mean by that? We said that in a food chain, we saw the movement of energy from the primary consumer all the way to the tertiary consumer. However, it's important that we recognize that often your tertiary consumers could feed on many different species, and so it's not linked to one linear flow of energy. So we find that the more diverse an ecosystem is, that there are many interconnected food chains where a tertiary consumer consumes many different types of secondary consumers, and in turn a secondary consumer also consumes many different types, and this creates an interconnectedness in that environment, and that we can represent that using food webs. So here, if you look at it, a classical example would be a food web in the grasslands, and here we're seeing the primary producers producing food, and we've got grasses and we've got trees, and these are consumed by your primary consumers, and you can see a whole variety of consumers consuming the products from a single producer. Likewise, we see that the grass here is consumed by different types of consumers. You've got your herbivores, you've got your omnivores, you've got more herbivores that are consuming them. In turn, these primary consumers, for example, if we look at the giraffe, is consumed by leopard, consumed by cheetahs, or even by lion. Likewise, we see the zebras that have multiple consumers that feed off it. And so in this complex food chain, we see many different food chains connected, and that we refer to as a food web. A food web is a more representative of the actual feeding pathways within an ecosystem because organisms usually eat more than one type of food. And as I mentioned, that in any environment, there's always different sources of food that an organism would consume. It's important that we know that these organisms are eaten by more than one predator. As we looked at this, if you look at the buck here, it's consumed by the leopard, the lion, and even sometimes the cheetahs. So again, it shows you that a predator may consume various different types of primary consumers. This means that unlike a food chain, organisms in a food web can occupy more than one trophic level. And so it's important that we recognize that sometimes in the complexities of food webs, that organisms in food webs may occupy different trophic levels depending on where they are situated, what they feed on, and whether they are consumed by other predators. And so that is the complexity of a food web. So here's another example of a pond ecosystem showing you a complex food web. Again, you can see the producers are the algae and the water weeds, which are your first trophic level. And these in turn have multiple levels of energy being consumed by. So a slug will feed on them, here you have flies that feed on them, as well as fish and prawn. In turn, these at a secondary level are consumed by your secondary consumers, and we see that at the tertiary level, we've got again many different predators or consumers feeding on multiple primary consumers and secondary consumers. As I mentioned when we started the segment, that there's energy lost in an ecosystem when it passes through. So as food is passed through along a food chain or food web, the amount of energy transferred gets less and less because energy is lost or used up by each organism. And we know that that energy is obviously going to decrease at every level. What do we mean by energy loss? And so when we refer to energy loss, we're referring to how the energy is passed on and what's it used for. So as I mentioned, when a plant is consumed, for example, by a caterpillar, a large amount of that energy, in this case we measure energy in joules, is used for growth. Some of that energy in its life is lost through waste products, and that is undigested and indigestible products. And then finally we see some of that energy is also used for respiration. So as a wrap, we know that there's a very small amount of energy actually available at the next trophic level. This illustration shows you, as we wrap this segment up, what is the transformation of energy in living organisms. If we assume that there's a value of 100% that's consumed by this herbivore, we can see that there's about 25% of that is stored in the building up of muscle and tissue. 25% of that energy is lost through cellular respiration and the physical movements that these organisms are going to carry out, and that they need that energy. We know that being an endotherm, lots of energy is lost and used in maintaining their body temperature. Also, there's waste that is lost and excreted. So the tissues store only 25% of that energy, which is then subsequently available to the next trophic level. So as we've just seen that energy is lost, as I started off the segment, I mentioned the following, that energy is passed down from one trophic level to the next, and about 90% of that energy is lost, with some being lost as heat, as we saw, to the environment because of respiration, and some of it being used, and a lot of it is lost due to indigested or incompletely digested food. So essentially, the primary consumers get about 10% of the energy that is the producers provide from the autotrophs, while the secondary consumers in turn get 1% of that energy, and finally your tertiary consumers getting 0.1% of that energy. So there's a significant decrease in the amount of energy as we move through a food chain.